Hello everyone, I am John Farner with the Irrigation Association. Thank you all for joining us for this post-election webinar, what to expect at the state and federal levels. This is one of our Bringing Water to Life webinars that we're having this year, and we're expecting to have some more into next year, which is very exciting. We'll go into that a little bit later on. Before I turn things over to Elizabeth McCartney on our staff, I wanted to just go through a few housekeeping items here. Number one, this is being recorded. So just keep that in mind. We hope to have this up on our YouTube page either later today, but most likely tomorrow, available to everyone. So if you missed something, want to go back and hear something, the recording of this will be available on our YouTube page, which you all will get an email about that after the webinar. And also, if you have any questions, please use the question box in your GoToWebinar toolbox on the right-hand side of your screen. This allows us to handle things a little bit easier than opening up microphones, etc. So if you have a question throughout, please type that into the box, and Elizabeth and I have set aside at the end of this webinar to answer your questions about anything that we've touched on here. So without further ado, let's turn things over to Elizabeth McCartney.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. I'm happy that we have some good turnout on this post-election webinar, considering I'm pretty sure most of us are a little tired of hearing about the election in general and the politics of it, but I'm hoping that today we'll be able to cover some insightful things about irrigation and about water management and what we look to see in 2017 next year. So I'm just going to kick this off. So, where's the... So just so you know, this is John Farner, and I'm Elizabeth McCartney, and we're going to be going over this webinar today. And at the end of it, you'll see our contact information. So if you have any other follow-up questions that we don't get to answer in the question and answer session, we're always available to respond to you. So just a little bit about the Irrigation Association. We are a very diverse association, as you can see here. We have members from agriculture, landscape, and golf irrigation. And on the ag side, we work with manufacturers, dealers, and end users. The landscape and golf side, our membership consists of manufacturers, distributors, and contractors. So the thing that brings us together is water. And we come around our mission statement to promote efficient irrigation. So this is our current strategic plan. Our mission, as I said, is to promote efficient irrigation. And then we have our core strategic initiatives, and our professional development are our main three things: advocacy and professional development. And so under advocacy, you'll see we have our government affairs and public affairs, which is what we're touching on today. But just so everyone knows, all of our advocacy work, our policy work, our legislative work, it's driven by our expertise that lives under professional development. So it's driven by our education, our training, and our certification. That is what we're experts in here at the association, and so that's what drives our policy. So just a quick outline of what we're going to cover today. This is a part of our webinar series, Bringing Water to Life. We're happy to kind of kick this off. We're going to have more coming into the next year. So today we're going to talk quickly about the presidential election, just a quick overview of that, some of the state elections and the governors that took office, that will be taking office next year, Congress, what their priorities are right now during this lame duck. They're not going to be here much longer in D.C., so what do they really need to get done? Then John's going to take over, and he's going to dive into President Trump's first 100 days and what he's already outlined for that. Then we're going to touch on irrigation and what federal priorities and state priorities will be for our association and the industry going into next year. So quickly, this is the presidential election electoral college map, which I'm sure everyone is sick of seeing, but we just wanted to hit on it really quickly. As you can see, Michigan was called, I think, end of last week, finally, for Trump. He won that by around 10,000 votes, so that was very close. So the final count is 306 electoral votes for Donald Trump. The other really close states were Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. He won Wisconsin by 27,000 votes and Pennsylvania by 68,000 votes. So, Trump was able to get the votes in the right places, the amount of votes, and so he is the president-elect, and we've been doing a lot, reading about what he's going to be working on next year, and we look forward to hearing what John has to say kind of about the first 100 days and what we can expect for our industry and some of the initiatives that are going to be taking place under a Trump administration. So when Trump does come into office in 2017, this is what Congress is going to look like. So the Republican Party keeps control of both the House and the Senate, which will be good, obviously, for a Trump administration to work on their different initiatives that they're proposing. There is actually 2 seats in the House that have not been decided yet. Both are in Louisiana. One of them, it's 2 Republicans that are going to be having a runoff in December, so we know that's going to be a Republican seat. The other one, though, is at Louisiana's 4th district. They're going to be having a runoff in December, and so we're not sure yet if that'll be a Democratic or Republican seat. And then you'll see there's also a runoff in the Louisiana Senate to decide who that will be. And then the 2 lighter dots at the bottom of the Senate seat, you'll see those are just independent seats, but they caucus with the Democrats, so those are counted as Democrats. And then for the state elections, so there were 12 elections for governor that took place in 2016. And so as you can see, North Carolina is the only one that is not decided yet. So right now, the current incumbent governor is down by around 10,000 votes in North Carolina, but he has not conceded the election yet. They're looking into auditing or doing a recount of the election, and so that one is still up in the air. I think it will be resolved soon, though, just based on the numbers coming in, and because when they're doing some of the recounts and some of the counties that they want to look at, the numbers still are increasing for the person running against him. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that, but I think that one will be decided soon. So the current person that would take over is the Democratic Attorney General, Roy Cooper. So he is currently winning that race. And North Carolina is actually a state that the Irrigation Association has been pretty active in, so it'll be interesting to see how that race turns out. We've been working on licensing in that state. So right now, the state of North Carolina does have professional licensing for irrigation contractors. There have been a bill proposed to get rid of that licensing because the state legislature is really trying to cut back on the amount of professional licenses in the state. So we've been very active in that. We're not quite sure yet what Cooper would think of a licensing bill and how he'd respond to that. Would he sign it? Would he not? But that's something we're going to keep our eyes open for, and to see if a change in governor would shift the focus of the legislature at all away from getting rid of licensing. And so if our priorities would change in that state. But we're still actively working to protect the license in North Carolina, and there will be a hearing next week down there for one of the committees that we're going to be helping engage in. So just to close here on my end, so Congress is, as you know, in a lame duck session right now. There are a few must-pass bills. So just quickly to touch on those, the Defense Authorization, the National Defense Authorization Act, that's a bill that they pass every year. It's been passed 54 years in a row, so I'm pretty confident they're going to get that done. We'll see. The House is voting this week, and the Senate should follow pretty quickly after that. The next one is the 21st Century Cures Act. This is a bipartisan effort to approve for drugs and devices. This is another one that they just need to get done before they leave. The ones that concern us are obviously the continuing resolution, because that is what keeps the government funded. Most likely, they are going to get something together through March. So the Trump administration has signaled they would prefer that. Speaker Paul Ryan has signaled that he is supportive of a short-term continuing resolution only through March. So that's most likely what we're going to see for that. I'll go into that a little bit more in a bit. And then the Water Resources Development Act we'll touch on. So as you can see here, right now the short-term continuing resolution goes until December 9th, so Congress has to get something done before then. They are in session until December 16th, both the House and Senate, so they'll have another week to work on those other priorities I mentioned. So they're going to be finalizing the budget pretty quickly. Then we have the Water Resources Development Act, which is something that we have been following very closely. So the Senate passed this Water Infrastructure Act back on September 15th. In a bipartisan fashion, as you can see, and their bill actually did include the authorization of the Environmental Protection Agency's WaterSense program. This is something that we have been extremely supportive of. We have sent letters in support of this based on some other bills that it's been included in, so we're following that very carefully. The House version did not end up including the WaterSense authorization, and they passed theirs on September 28th. The main reason was because this bill was more controversial on the House side. The big component of this bill, both in the Senate and House, is the Flint, Michigan aid for the lead crisis in their water right now. So that's why in the House it was a little bit more controversial, and they weren't able to even consider amendments that would have included WaterSense authorization. So we're following that very closely, and we'll keep everyone posted on that. And now I'm going to turn it over to John.
All right, thanks, Elizabeth. So I get to talk about the fun stuff here, going past the rhetoric that was in the election into what to expect now that we have a new president-elect and how it really affects the irrigation industry. As Elizabeth mentioned, things were a lot closer than what they seemed to be in the election, and whether you hear the president-elect has a mandate or not is really a matter of perspective, because if you go back and look at the electoral votes, it looked like he won a pretty wide margin, but then Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by about 2 million votes. So whether or not there's a mandate or not, again, is not eye of the beholder. President-elect Trump thinks he does have a mandate, so let's take a look at what we can expect here. First, I love using this picture. This has been up, for those of you who have not been to Washington, D.C. over the past couple of years. Earlier on last year, I think it was late 2015 actually, this sign went up shortly after Donald Trump decided to lease out the old post office building from the federal government and build his new hotel. This is right around the same time he announced his candidacy for president, and so it's the irony of coming 2016 Trump is not lost on anyone here. And he'll move from the 1100 block of Pennsylvania Avenue to the 1600 block of Pennsylvania Avenue come January 20th. So this sign has actually become a pretty big tourist destination in Washington, D.C., believe it or not. So let's first look at who he's tapping to lead some of the agencies that affect irrigation. I'm going to talk about three in particular, the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, the United States Environmental Protection Agency, as well as the U.S. Department of the Interior. There are others that focus on water, but these three are generally the most high-profile ones that we in the irrigation industry worked most closely with on the federal side. So let's start out with the Secretary of Agriculture. You'll see here that there are four names that keep coming up focusing on the Department of Agriculture. And this could come as early as this week, as late as January 20th. We just don't know when he's going to announce his full cabinet. You heard earlier this morning that Tom Price, congressman from Georgia, has been announced as Secretary of Health and Human Services. Another announcement later on today. I believe it's not an official announcement, but it's been leaked that Elaine Chao, who is the former Secretary of the Department of Labor, is going to be tapped the new Secretary of Transportation, which, believe it or not, is going to have an effect on some things water coming up here pretty soon. And I'll go into the reasons why here. But let's focus on ag real quick. There are four names that have been percolating to the top over the past month or so. First is Sam Brownback, governor of Kansas. Big focus on water. He's driven actually a water plan in the state of Texas. A lot of focus on water given the water situation that's in Kansas. So if he were to come in as Agriculture Secretary, you can bet there'd be a focus on water throughout that agency. Second is Chuck Connor. Chuck Connor was actually Deputy Secretary of Agriculture in the George W. Bush administration, and he currently serves as the President of the National Association of Farmer Cooperatives. I'll skip over Sid for a second. Sonny Perdue, former governor of Georgia. Interesting about Sonny Perdue, when he was governor of Georgia, he did not have a big focus on agriculture. So the fact that his name's been rising to the top as the Secretary of Ag, I don't know the reasons why. There has to be some interest there on the part of President-elect Trump as well as Governor Perdue. But he is the former governor of Georgia. Given its agricultural state, that could be a reason why. And then Sid Miller. Sid is a newer Commissioner of Agriculture. He's been in that seat for, I believe, 2 years now. Sid is not without controversy. He sent out some controversial tweets during the election, used some profane language against one of the candidates, against Hillary Clinton. So I'm not sure if President-elect Trump is going to welcome him into his administration or not, but his name has been a solid candidate from the day after President Trump won the election. So again, we don't have any inside information on who's going to be chosen here. We do know that the Ag Steering Committee during the campaign was a robust list of who's who, both inside and outside of Washington, D.C. The Irrigation Association has worked with that steering committee, as well as the transition team, making sure that folks know about the water quantity initiatives that we've undertaken, as well as a level of knowledge that occurs when dealing with drought, water use in agriculture, etc. So next, I'm looking at the candidates for the Secretary of the Interior. If you recall, early days after Donald Trump won the election, there was a lot of talk about his kids participating in the administration. Now, there is a federal law against this. There's a federal nepotism law that came out after John F. Kennedy appointed his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, as the Attorney General, a lot of folks thought that Robert F. Kennedy was not suited to become Attorney General at that point in time. So there is a federal nepotism law that would prohibit Donald Trump from appointing his kids in these types of positions. However, there are ways around that. They can forego salary. You'll notice that his son-in-law, Ivanka's husband, is probably going to be announced as a high-profile consultant to the White House, to Donald Trump when he becomes president. Regardless, Donald Trump Jr.'s name has now gone away from the candidates of Secretary of the Interior. It sounds as though his kids are going to be leading the blind trust that is going to oversee the Trump organization. Now, looking at who are the candidates for Secretary of the Interior, you'll note here that there is a transition lead. And it's Doug Domenech, former Secretary of Virginia's Department of Natural Resources, actually was also part of the George W. Bush administration in the Department of the Interior. So though he's not a quote-unquote lobbyist right now, he took over for a lobbyist as the transition lead. He is not a current lobbyist, so when Mike Pence took over the full transition, he decided Doug would be the best to lead the efforts for the parachute team into the department. So the folks that have gone to the top right now, I'll talk about Forrest Lucas first. You may know about Lucas Oil from the stadium rights name in Indianapolis, Indiana, Lucas Oil Stadium. However, he has a profound interest in agriculture. He's founded Protect the Harvest, which talks a lot about agricultural operations throughout the United States, very much pro-agriculture, and has a lot of interest in topics that the Department of Interior oversees. Another name that keeps popping up is Robert Grady, and you'll hear his name later on. As you can see, he has been with the Herbert Walker Bush administration and has background in natural resources, energy, and science. And others, Harold Hamm, Sarah Palin, who I know you all are familiar with, given her vice presidential candidacy with John McCain, and Jan Brewer, who's a former governor of Arizona. So her knowledge on Western issues that are very significant to the Interior Department is pretty large. And then finally, taking a look at the EPA. And this is going to be a pretty big deal for agriculture, for water, for landscape irrigation, a whole kit and caboodle here for several reasons. And I'll go into those reasons why later on. But right now, the transition lead. Now, when I say transition lead, you've heard in the news that Mike Pence took over for Chris Christie as the main leader of the transition. Now, there is a federal law that talks about step-by-step how the transition of power will take place. Before, Chris Christie was the head of the transition, and he signed what's called a memorandum of an understanding with the White House, which allowed the new president-elect's team to share knowledge and data with the current sitting administration. When he was removed from power in that lead, removed from that position, and Mike Pence was named as leader of the transition, you heard all this talk about how Mike Pence did not sign this new MOU. Well, that MOU is dictated by law. It is necessary. He did sign that, and when he signed that, anybody that they dictate is part of the transition, they're able to talk to members of each agency to talk about what they're doing, how they do it, how the agency department should be run, is currently being run, what current policies are in place, what's in the pipeline, all this information. The administration just doesn't come in on January 20th and start learning things right away. This starts the day after the election, or the day after the president-elect is deemed the winner of the election. So the transition lead is Myron Ebel. He's a director at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, which is a pretty conservative organization. The biggest thing about Myron is that he is a non-believer, or he's been called a skeptic, on climate change. Now, this is very much in line with Donald Trump's position on climate change as well. He's a skeptic. During the campaign, he said that human effects on climate are minimal. He has since backtracked on that a little bit since being named president-elect. Regardless, the viewpoints on President-elect Trump, Myron Ebel, and those two, in comparison to President Obama, have a vast difference between the two. Vast difference. So the perspective of the EPA and how they govern, how they regulate, is going to be much, much different than I've seen in my professional career, and I'm sure others have seen in their professional careers as well. So right now, Myron Ebel's name is actually at the top of the list to be the new administrator of the EPA. Other names that have come up, again, Robert Grady, I mentioned him in the Interior Department as well, and then Jeffrey Homestead as well, who was a deputy EPA administrator in the George W. Bush administration. I'm going to keep talking about the EPA real quick as well. There have been some articles out there and some rumors and some announcements, though not direct, to be inferred from President Trump, that the EPA, while it's not going to be dismantled, it's going to be run much differently. A lot of the programs that EPA regulates are either going to be drastically defunded, not enforced, or given to the states to enforce themselves, and no matter how they see fit. That's a vast difference than what we've seen over the past 8 years, and actually a difference that we saw in the George W. Bush administration too. In fact, Christine Todd Whitman, who was the first EPA administrator under George W. Bush, was actually quoted today in saying that the way that the EPA is going to be run over the next 4 years is different than we've ever seen in our entire lives. And I'll go into reasons why that affects the irrigation industry specifically, but I do believe that we're going to see big changes occur throughout the EPA over the next 4 years. So that brings us to the first 100 days. Let's fast forward to January 20th, the day he takes the oath of office, and then January 21st, which is his first full day as President of the United States. The last time we saw a contract with America was in 1994 into 1995, when the Republican Revolution, or the Red Wave, came over Congress, when they won back Congress when President Clinton sat in office, and there was a contract with the American people. Now, where that differs from this is that was with Congress. Newt Gingrich drove that, if you recall, and that was a contract with Congress, with the American people, on they are going to pass these bills. And it's up to President Bill Clinton to sign those into law. Now, where this contract differs is that the first page, which I'm going to go over in a second, are things he's going to do himself. He does not need Congress to do this. They are things that he is going to do from day one by himself through executive order or just from the power of the presidency. And the second page talks about things he's going to do with Congress, whether it's going to be finding some champions on the Hill to introduce bills, things he's going to drive legislatively. Those are things he is going to drive himself throughout Congress. So let's go back to the first page. And I'm not going to read it verbatim word for word, but I do want to highlight a lot of this stuff if you have not seen it. So you'll see the highlighted red areas there. The first one is 6 measures to clean up corruption and special interest collusion in Washington, D.C. So the first thing I can think of is we're still going to see a lot of the rhetoric that we've heard throughout the election, throughout his presidency, if these are the words he's choosing. And we're going to see that other things like drain the swamp are included here as well. So it's a lot of the same type of words, the same rhetoric, as I call it. Things from term limits, proposing a constitutional amendment. Second, and this is very important, is going to be a hiring freeze on all federal employees to reduce the federal workforce through attrition. Now, there are some exemptions there: military, public safety, public health. Now, areas where irrigation industry is interested: the Natural Resources Conservation Service at USDA, the WaterSense program at EPA, some of the Bureau of Rec offices, where those jobs are not deemed necessary for public health and public safety. If someone were to leave, their job would need to be either replaced by someone who already works for the federal government, or that position will be done away with completely. And that's very important, and he can do this through executive order because he is essentially the CEO of the federal government. Any new regulation that is proposed needs to have 2 existing regulations eliminated. 5-year ban on White House congressional officials becoming lobbyists, lifetime ban on when officials lobbying on behalf of foreign government, and another having to do with lobbyists raising money for American elections. Now, where those come into play, he needs to fill about 4,000 positions in the federal government. And historically, a lot of these positions have come from the lobbying community. Honestly, folks like me, folks like Elizabeth, who are federally registered, have had positions in the administration before. I used to be a political appointee within administration, and I'm able to now work for this association and this industry, serving as the liaison to the federal government. If I were to work for this administration, I could not do that. So it's really limiting his pool of people interested in working for him, who have been deemed quote-unquote experts in the past in Washington, D.C. The second section is actions to protect the American workers. This is where we goes into trade. Renegotiating NAFTA, withdrawing from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has a lot of ramifications for agriculture because agriculture is a big part of the TPP. And then labeling China as a currency manipulator, which is something that no other president has done in the past. Again, goes more into trade. This also talks about infrastructure projects, and I'm going to talk about that later, but if you go into the 7th star under the 7 actions to protect American workers, cancel billions in payments to the United Nations climate change programs and use the money to fix America's water and environmental infrastructure. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on. And then finally, in the first page, 5 actions to restore security and the constitutional rule of law. And this goes into canceling federal funding for sanctuary cities. We're talking about immigration here, etc. So that's where that comes into play. So those are things he can do himself without any kind of congressional action whatsoever. The second page are things that he's going to work with Congress on. This is where he goes into his tax plan that he talked about a lot during his campaign. Tariffs for companies who lay off American workers and move overseas. The Energy and Infrastructure Act. This goes back into what I talked about with infrastructure. Infrastructure is a pretty big deal for him, and I'll go into that in a little bit. School Choice and Education Opportunity Act. You saw his nominee for the Secretary of Education, a big proponent of school choice. So this is going to have a lot of focus in his administration. Same thing with repeal and replace the Obamacare Act. Tom Price, who is the nominee for Secretary of HHS, is actually one of the lead sponsors for the replacement of the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, in Congress. Legal immigration, restoring community safety, national security, and then finally, cleaning up corruption in Washington Act. It enacts new ethics reforms to, quote, drain the swamp and reduce the corrupting influence of special interest on our politics. So when you focus on the first 100 days, that's what we're talking about here, are those issues. Now, what he does after those first 100 days remains to be seen, but he has a lot to do in his first 100 days as president, first 3 months, give or take, to accomplish these goals. Now, let's look at how this affects the irrigation industry specifically. So first is what I mentioned in regulatory enforcement. And I don't think he's going to use a Perrier bottle to solve the California water crisis. However, I do think there are some other things he's announced that will be done, and I'll go into right now with the Endangered Species Act and how it's being enforced. During the campaign season, he did go to California. He went to Fresno. He visited the Delta. and basically said that California, I'm paraphrasing, has enough water, we need to open up the pumps to pump more water out of the Bay Delta for the American farmer. Now, this is something that the agriculture community in California has been rallying around for a while now, looking at how the Endangered Species Act is enforced, specifically when looking at the salmon and Delta smelt in the Delta. So this is something that he will need to work with his Secretary of the Interior on changing that enforcement rule in the Bay Delta with the Endangered Species Act. The second is Clean Water Act. So many of you heard of what's called WOTUS, the Waters of the United States, that has been renamed as the Clean Water Act rule. Basically, it is changing the way, the interpretation of the Clean Water Act to include all waters of the United States would fall under the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act with certain exemptions. A lot of ag operations are exempted and others. However, the fact that includes all waters and it puts a lot of pressure, it brings a lot more water under the federal government's protection that is currently being managed by the state. That is of utmost concern. That's something the Irrigation Association has been against. Other agriculture, turf, landscape associations have been against, and we've joined with them in asking the federal government to look at this a bit differently, knowing that the Clean Water Act needs to be changed how it's enforced now. It needs more clarity. However, the way they went about it is not correct. So Donald Trump has promised in his campaign to ditch that rule, so to speak. So whether that's so or not remains to be seen. The second thing we're going to be looking at is government funding. I mentioned WaterSense. This is something of concern for the irrigation industry. WaterSense is not authorized, and it's not funded very high right now. It gets its funding from the Office of the Administrator, and it has jurisdiction under the National Safe Drinking Water Act. However, there is no act in Congress that has created WaterSense program. It does not get its funding from the federal government. So whoever the administrator of the EPA is, when they're looking at cutting programs, WaterSense may or may not be cut. We don't know. It can be just done through the administrator's decision. So we're going to keep a close eye on this as well. And then Farm Bill programs. So again, Donald Trump is not a big fan of subsidies. President-elect Trump is not a big fan of subsidies. He's not a big fan of what he calls pork. And historically, a lot of Farm Bill programs have been seen as pork. Fortunately, the EQIP program within the Farm Bill under the conservation title has had widespread support because it's seen as a voluntary program that can actually reduce the need for regulations down the road. So how that transcribes into a new Farm Bill, which President-elect Trump will be involved in, he's going to be signing a new Farm Bill into law, remains to be seen. And finally, infrastructure. There is a lot of focus on infrastructure throughout the Trump administration. You saw that he's going to cut funding for the UN climate programs and fund water and energy infrastructure programs, water and environment infrastructure programs in the United States. We can all agree that infrastructure needs to be dealt with, and whether that is a dam, a canal, an irrigation ditch, or just your pipes for the municipal water supply, they all need to be updated. We still have infrastructure that dates back to the 1800s for municipal water and the 1700s for agriculture. And so a lot of those need to be updated. So we're going to be working with the Trump administration on that as well. So how does that relate to the Irrigation Association's 2017 legislative priorities? Well, first, as I mentioned, we want to authorize and fund the EPA's WaterSense program. We believe in this program. It is a voluntary program. We believe that it enhances the market for water-efficient technologies, products, and services. So we believe in this program. It was formed under a Republican administration. We believe that it works. And we like to see that this codified basically into law, that it exists, and then see funding increase from that as well. I mentioned Farm Bill. We want to pass a strong Farm Bill that promotes a safe and reliable food supply. This includes a strong EQIP title that enhances the focus on water infrastructure and irrigation funding for farmers throughout the United States. So when we do have a new administration come in that has a different focus on regulation than Donald Trump has, we would have those good practices in place to reduce the need for agriculture to be regulated. We want to fund water infrastructure projects that focuses on and increases the amount of water available for irrigation. This includes alternative water sources, water supply, purple pipe to residential and commercial properties, so we don't need to use potable water for irrigation in these settings. This includes agricultural operations where we do have old canals and water loss does occur. If we don't have that water loss in infrastructure, that means more water is available to the end user, whether it's a farmer, golf course, commercial, residential user, it doesn't matter. We think that with the amount of water used in irrigation, if we increase the technologies used in irrigation along with an updated infrastructure, we will have a lot more water available for every use out there. Eliminate the new Clean Water Act rule. I mentioned that before. Promote a tax plan that incentivizes farmers to use efficient irrigation technologies. This is something that the Irrigation Association's Government Affairs Committee has a few months. And we're looking at opportunities where either new farmers or farmers who don't qualify for EQIP cost share to look at incentives to use for efficient irrigation. And then approach new ways of addressing drought throughout the United States. And there's a reason why I mention that now. So this is our current drought monitor that was released last week. You'll see here that there are major areas throughout the United States that are experiencing drought. It is not just California. Many of you live in these areas. Tennessee specifically has been in the news a lot, especially this morning, given the wildfires that are occurring there right now through Gatlinburg into Pigeon Forge, parts of Tennessee, but they're spreading in North Carolina and Florida and Virginia as well. These are the effects of drought. There's been a lot of press in Alabama recently that they are expecting a long-term drought. Now there is a significant water supply there in the groundwater, but how long will that last? We need to make sure we are focusing on short-term ways to address drought, but also long-term solutions and ways we can mitigate the effects of drought when it hits. So we're not always just in disaster relief mode. We're actually funding ways to be prepared for drought, and we believe efficient irrigation is one way of doing this. Whether we're looking at efficient irrigation in agriculture to ensure that we're not using more water than we have to in agriculture, or it's on the landscape side where we have a viable, healthy landscape that is not prone to wildfires like we're seeing right now. I know a lot of those wildfires are occurring in forests and unmanaged lands, but when they get close to residential areas and the city centers, we don't need to have dead turf, dead trees to amplify those fires. We need to have those healthy so they can help combat the spread of wildfire. These are things that need to be addressed in whatever drought bills that occur in the future, and something we are going to be focusing on later on. So state priorities. Elizabeth mentioned what's going on in the states, and I'm going to touch on this as well. You'll see this, the bottom is what she showed earlier with the states listed in the names are the ones that had gubernatorial elections, with North Carolina, she mentioned, still up in the air. And we are not sure, as she mentioned, when that is going to be fixed. For those of you following that, Cooper is in the lead, the Democratic, and for all intents and purposes, McCrory, who's the Republican, if it was anybody else, may have dropped out by now. But I think he's trying to play the long game here to see if he can actually get this to the legislature and have them decide, which, if that's the case, who knows what's going to happen. So that could be, again, be fixed. Called tomorrow, could be called in January. We're just not sure. So our state priorities moving into 2017. Number one is licensing. And you'll see throughout the United States the band of red states that are out there. These states believe in less regulation. And I'm generalizing here. There are some states who, Republican governors, who believe in regulating trades like landscape irrigation, like landscape architecture, and other licenses that you see out there. However, many see this as an impeding from folks getting jobs. They want to create jobs, and we are stopping folks from getting jobs because these licenses exist. It's what we're seeing in states like North Carolina with some of the discussions going on down there and others. So when we're looking at licensing, we're really looking at protecting our scope of practice. And I like using the term scope of practice because this is bigger than licensing. This is making sure that our landscape irrigation contractors can do what they're trained to do, are able to do so without having to report up through a plumber or a landscape architect. In some states, the licensing of an irrigation contractor, an irrigation landscape contractor, is through the landscape architecture license or is through a plumbing license. We believe at the Irrigation Association that if a license exists, that board should be made up of peers of landscape irrigation contractors because of the specific knowledge necessary to manage that water in the landscape. And the licenses exist to protect the health and safety, public safety of citizens. So that's something that we argue or promote in different states when talking about states licensing. And we're trying to protect our folks, irrigation contractors, to do the job they're trained and hired to do. Second is drought planning. There are many states out there that either are in drought now, as you see up there, or they're seeing the drought percolate into their states. I live in Maryland. We're in a drought right now. Hopefully some of the rain we're getting is going to alleviate some of that drought. But if you're in the southeast or in California, you know this, a lot of drought planning occurs. This drought planning can go into what level of drought needs to exist to turn off the water for irrigation, to, like in California, have a model water efficient landscape ordinance, and what that means, what that water efficient landscape ordinance means. So we have a model ordinance that we have on our website that we promote and bring to localities and states to look at ways to manage irrigation. We have ideas on how to mitigate effects of current drought or you're planning for drought without turning off irrigation right away. Listen, we all know that when push comes to shove, we're going to turn off irrigation before we turn off water for human safety. We get it. But because of the benefits that occur in the landscape, we want to make sure that a significant drought plan is in place. Other one is water restrictions. Again, whether you're in drought or not, we're looking at how that water is used, whether during drought or not in drought, our availability of alternative water sources for irrigation, and the technology incentives, whether it's WaterSense, SWAT, or others, ways to incentivize the most efficient use of technology, both in agriculture as well, in both landscape as well as agriculture. Looking at state incentives that exist or can exist, whether through tax, through rebates, etc. So those are our state priorities moving into 2017. Now, before I move into question and answers, I do want to say a few things here. First, our webinar series, it's coming in 2017, Bringing Water to Life. We had it in 2015, took a year off. We're excited to bring it back in 2017, so keep an eye out for future webinars on that as well. We do have a podcast. The Irrigation Association does have a podcast. It's called the Bringing Water to Life podcast. We talk about everything water, everything irrigation. You'll hear from myself, Elizabeth, who you heard from earlier, as well as Brent Meekum. We are the three hosts of that podcast. We have a little bit of fun, and so we hope you can check that out. The website is bwtlpodcast.com. We've had 10 episodes so far. We're going to be recording some more coming up here at the show in Las Vegas next week as well. So stop by and say hello. And if you just want to introduce yourself to us while we're out there, please do so as well. This is our contact information. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions for you later on if you have any questions later on. But in the meantime, if you have any questions, please ask them now. We don't have any yet. So if you have any questions, please type them into the box. Let us know. You've purposely set aside about 15 minutes for a Q&A, anything about the election, about President-elect Trump's focus moving into next year, and as well as the Irrigation Association's priorities. Now's your chance. Please let us know. I'm going to just give a couple seconds here before we end it. Anything to add, Elizabeth? We're ready? Oh, we do have a question pop up. Yep.
Yep.
So, WaterSense in the House and Senate energy bills. That's a great question. You want to take that, Elizabeth?
Yeah, so it is in those bills as well, and they were working in a conference committee, but really, at this point, nothing's going to happen with those bills. I mean, they have too much on their agenda to get done in the lame duck. The Senate moves very slowly. They have to have a lot of floor time for many pieces of legislation. It's limited in the number of bills they can move quickly, just based on their process. So I don't think they're going to be wasting time with that when they're trying to get all this floor work done. They're not going to be working kind of on those other things when they're focused on their bills.
I agree with that. If Hillary Clinton were to have won the presidency, I think we would have seen both WRDA and even possibly an energy bill passed and signed into law by President Obama. But because there is going to be a Republican legislature along with a Republican president, we're going to see just enough done to keep the government open, unfortunately. So we worked very hard with other organizations to get that WaterSense language in those bills, and that's the best thing that we can. The best thing we can do is continue to promote WaterSense as part of these relevant bills later on. So the next question, I want to talk about this. Why does the IA want to eliminate the new Clean Water Act rule? The Clean Water Act rule that exists so first it was WOTUS and then rebranded as Clean Water Act rule. This mostly has to deal with clean water, water quality instead of water quantity. So we have not taken the lead on anything to do with the Clean Water Act other than supporting what the landscape community as well as the agriculture community have promoted, because we align ourselves with those areas of interest. We have also aligned ourselves with that. I will say that there are some aspects of the Clean Water Rule that we like. There are areas in there, and quite frankly, we've gone on record along with the agriculture community to ask for a rule that's promulgated and available for open comment, which is what they did. However, the fact that the Clean Water Act rule opens up federal government involvement or oversight or available to regulate through all waters of the United States only to exempt certain things, we feel that should be the other way around. We feel that those exemptions should not have been part of the scope to begin with. And that was one of the biggest areas of concerns that we had. I'm going to... Okay, go ahead, Elizabeth.
So someone asked, are the House conferees ready to accept WaterSense in S2848? So that's the WRDA bill. I haven't heard much, but my assumptions are that it's not going to be a priority in the conferees. It's not something they're focusing on. I think right now it's going to be working out the differences between, especially the flood aid, how much they want to give. And that's going to be the big focus of that piece of legislation, along with obviously all the normal water infrastructure projects in there. So I don't see that. It could end up being in there if they don't want to, dwell on it, or it could not. We just haven't heard much. It's really not what the focus is of that bill.
Yeah, it could be a bargaining chip too.
Right.
Another question that came up, all kinds of questions, is great. Are farmers conflicted with the Trump presidency between getting more water but at the same time losing farm labor? I did not go into detail on immigration, but I can now. I used to work on immigration policy for both the administration as well as a lobbyist, so I know the issues regarding specifically farm labor that are out there right now. I'd say if I had to guess, now the Irrigation Association does not lobby directly on immigration. However, we have signed on to certain things here and there as it relates to farm labor and H-2B and things like that. But I would say that there is a lot of internal conflicts that are out there right now. The idea, a lot of the rhetoric, a lot of the messaging out of President Trump has been less regulation, which resonates very well with rural America. In fact, you'll see from the Democrats recently, specifically Tom Vilsack came out saying that Democrats need to do a better job reaching out to rural America, which I agree with. I agree with completely. And that's an area where Donald Trump resonated very well. However, you go into a lot of these areas, and there's a lot of concern about illegal immigration out there and the, quote, taking away of American jobs by these immigrants. But at the same time, you have a reliance on undocumented workers that are currently being used for farm labor. And California is a perfect example of this, a state where I think only one farming operation works under the H-2A program. And H-2A is the seasonal migrant workers for agriculture. The rest are undocumented. So there are a lot of conflicts that are out there. And the good news is that President Trump, he is listening to ag groups specifically on immigration. How that translates to what Jeff Sessions decides as the Attorney General, I don't know. But there is a lot of conflicted feelings out there. What is the overall feeling on your part that this administration will have on the irrigation industry and the IA? Again, I'll go back to the less regulation side. We're going to see, as far as regulating water, regulating business, that is all going to be reduced. There's no doubt about it. That's going to be reduced. It's going to be things like WaterSense. It's going to be things like the Farm Bill, programs that have been really championed by this industry that are going to have a big effect, and we don't know how that's going to be taken. So, overall feeling, I'm cautiously optimistic, very, very cautiously optimistic, just because a lot of what President Trump campaigned on isn't necessarily what is being enacted right now. So I don't know. We'll have to see after the first 100 days plays out and when he gets into office. Tribal governments, tell you right now, with tribal governments, when you're looking at the pipeline issue that's going on right now with Standing Rock, President-elect Trump is going to basically say, forget it, we're doing this pipeline. I do not see a scenario where he's going to listen to these tribal governments. As that relates to the water rights of tribal governments and how that's being administered, a lot of that is enacted by Congress and congressional law. So you do need, if anything is going to change, you do need an act of Congress to change that. And I don't see Congress having a big focus on water rights to tribal governments right now. So there's a question about certifications being promoted nationwide. And one of the things is we walk a very fine line with promoting our certifications between incentivizing and mandating. The Irrigation Association, now I'm speaking on behalf of our board of directors and direction that we've gotten from our Government Affairs Committee and board of directors, that we do not want to mandate that folks have our certification in order to do work, okay? We work a lot with states on licensing and whether you use a CIC for licensing or a CIT for licensing, or you need a CLIA in California to do the Model Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance. A lot of our focus is on that. But because landscape irrigation specifically is regulated state by state, number one, it'd be very difficult to promote a nationwide mandate or even an incentive to use certifications. However, we try to work different ways, knowing the processes in government, to look at if it's a federal contract, mandating that a CIC be used, or looking at state law, or looking at if it's a WaterSense something or other, you need to have our certifications. So I do not see any kind of mandates occur. However, I do see increased incentives and promotion, hopefully down the road as well. The SWAT labeling program, that's a great question. So we do a lot with SWAT. And for those of you who don't know, the SWAT program is a Smart Water Application Technologies. It's a partnership that the Irrigation Association has with water providers and industries throughout the United States. And so the question is actually a labeling program. It's not a labeling program, but we do have a testing protocol that products can go through and the results posted on the website. Now, these testing protocols are very similar to what exists in WaterSense right now. So if you were to go in and you'll see a weather-based irrigation controller is labeled by WaterSense, chances are you can go to the SWAT website and see how it performed in different areas throughout the test, different zones, etc., throughout the test. So it's valuable information for contractors, for water providers, and quite frankly, the end user to understand how these smart controllers work. And there are other testing protocols that are out there as well. Now, if WaterSense were to go away, SWAT would be the only game in town at that point. However, it's our perspective that SWAT and WaterSense need to work hand in hand to be successful to one another. They're kind of like we have an end goal today to rely on one another in order to be successful. That's our goal. So while I don't see direct impacts on SWAT, as we see the funding and the opportunities with WaterSense, I think that's where it's going to be. That's where those issues might come about. Do you have any thoughts on that? You work on SWAT a lot.
No, nothing really extra. I mean, it's, SWAT and EPA, WaterSense are very collaborative and work together. And if you all are coming to the show, we're going to have an area called the Oasis, where EPA is going to be giving a public comment period type thing on their new draft specification for spray sprinkler heads or bodies. So hopefully people can come to that. So yeah, it's very collaborative. So I don't see any direct impact on SWAT, but like John said, depending on what happens with WaterSense, we're going to continue to work on SWAT, but we're very collaborative with EPA WaterSense.
I think we got all the questions in. Hopefully we answered them all. It looks like hopefully we did. If there's no other questions, we're at 2:58 on the East Coast. We really appreciate you calling into this. Hopefully we answered all your questions, gave you a little bit of insight of what to expect, not to expect, or just to be more confused now than you were before. But again, if you have any questions at all, please email us. If you see the show, please introduce yourself, say hello to us, and stay in touch, and we'll be in contact in the future with more updates, more webinars regarding the Spring and Water Life initiative that we have. So,
thank you for joining.
Thanks a lot. We really appreciate it.